Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why the same task in psychology experiments sometimes gives tricky results, or why measuring things like brain power is so complicated? Well, this new study dives deep into that, trying to make psychology research more reliable and easier to understand. It is all about a cool new way to look at data from experiments, especially when we're trying to understand how people differ. So imagine researchers want to figure out how different people react to a task, like how quickly they can do something or how accurately. For a long time, psychology has had two main parts. One is experimental psychology, which looks at how things change between different groups or conditions, like seeing if a new teaching method helps students learn better. The other is correlational psychology, or psychometrics, which focuses on how individuals differ from each other, like seeing if intelligence scores relate to happiness. Cronbach, a famous psychologist, wanted to bring these two together. This paper is a big step in that direction, trying to create a unified framework for psychometrics in experimental psychology. The core idea is building on something called hierarchical factor models, or HFMS. These models are great because they can look at the true differences between people while also accounting for the random noise that happens during any single experiment trial. Think of it like trying to measure someone's actual height versus their height as measured by a slightly wobbly tape measure. The HFM tries to get closer to the true height. But the original HFM had a big assumption. It thought all the data, like people's reaction times, followed a neat bell curve, a normal distribution. The problem is, reaction times in real life are often not bell-shaped. They're usually skewed, meaning they have a long tail on one side. This is where the researchers in this new paper come in. They've created a standardized, generalized HFM, or GenHFM, which takes the HFM and makes it more powerful and realistic. They've added two key things. First, they allow the model to handle those skewed response times, which are super common in psychology experiments. Second, they've made the whole factor structure standardized. This is a fancy way of saying they've put everything on a common scale, making it way easier to compare how different experimental tasks measure the same underlying thing. So, how does this work? Instead of assuming a nice, clean bell curve for reaction times, they use more flexible distributions like the X-Gaussian or shifted log-normal distribution, which are much better at capturing real-world skewed data. This is super important because, as their research shows, if you try to fit a simple bell curve model to data that isn't shaped like a bell, you can get really wrong answers. They ran a big simulation study to test this. Imagine they created tons of fake data. Some data was generated using the old normal distribution HFM assumption, and some was generated using the more realistic, skewed distributions of their new GenFM. When they tried to use the old Gaussian HFM on data that was actually skewed, the results were often way off. They found that the model could underestimate the actual connection between people's abilities by as much as 50%. That's a huge deal. Their new GenFM, however, was much more accurate. It gave unbiased and more efficient estimates, meaning it got closer to the true values and was more certain about them. This figure really hammers home why using a factor model like the HFM is better than just looking at simple correlations between tasks. It shows that when you have more tasks or measures, the factor model becomes much more precise at estimating the true relationships, especially when those relationships are small. This means we can get a clearer picture of what is really going on. Now, let's talk about that standardized part of the GenFM. In regular models, a number might mean 50 milliseconds, or something that depends on the original units of measurement. But with standardization, those numbers become like correlation coefficients. A factor loading of, say, 0.7 means that the task is strongly related to that underlying mental process. This makes it super easy to compare tasks directly. You can see which task is a better measure of, for example, inhibitory control because its standardized loading will be higher. This is a game changer for evaluating how good our experimental tasks are at measuring what they're supposed to. This diagram shows different ways these factor models can be set up. A unidimensional model assumes there is just one main underlying factor, like if all tasks measure broadly intelligence. Multidimensional models allow for more complex structures with multiple correlated factors, which is often more realistic. And they can be confirmatory, testing a specific theory, or exploratory, letting the data suggest the structure. The paper uses a Bayesian framework. Now, don't let that word scare you. In simple terms, Bayesian statistics lets us update our beliefs about something as we see more data. It also helps a lot when you don't have a ton of data in your study. It gives you a full picture of the uncertainty, not just a single number. This is great for psychology, where sample sizes can sometimes be small. After the simulations, they tested their GenFM on real data from two studies. One looked at tasks related to executive control, like the famous Stroop task, which tests your ability to suppress a dominant response. They wanted to see if different versions of these tasks measured the same underlying skill. In the first example, they looked at data from studies using inhibition tasks like Stroop, Flanker, and Simon. The original analysis didn't find strong connections between these tasks, suggesting they might measure different things. But when the researchers applied their GenFM, especially one that could handle skewed response time, they found that the tasks were actually more related than previously thought. This means that sometimes the problem isn't that there is no connection between skills, but that the models used to analyze the data weren't capturing it accurately. This figure is a fantastic illustration of what the GenAFM can do. It shows the strength of the connection between each task and the underlying common factor. In the early experiments, the lines are flat and spread out, suggesting not much of a connection. But in experiment 3, the lines are clearly higher and more concentrated, showing that those tasks were much better at measuring the common skill of handling conflict. It really highlights how experimental design matters. The second example looked at different versions of the spatial Stroop task and tried to figure out if they measured the same things. The original study used some complex statistical methods. But again, when the researchers applied their GenFM, they found that the model that best fit the data was the one that could handle skewed reaction times. This table shows how reliable each task is at measuring the underlying effect. The old methods using Gaussian models often overestimated reliability. The GenSM, by using a more appropriate distribution for the skewed data, gave more realistic reliability estimates. This is crucial for knowing if your task is actually a good measure or just noisy. So, what is the big takeaway from all of this? The researchers are saying that by combining the strengths of experimental tasks and psychometric modeling, and by using models that can handle the messy reality of skewed data and provide standardized comparable results, we can get a much clearer and more accurate picture of individual differences in psychology. They're not just saying these models are better. They're showing that using the wrong model can lead to completely wrong conclusions. It is like trying to measure a mountain with a ruler. You need the right tools for the job. Of course, no study is perfect. The researchers mentioned that choosing the right trial level distribution is important, and while they focused on predictive accuracy, other methods like Bayes factors could also be explored. They also point out that figuring out the exact number of underlying factors can be tricky and might need new methods. And they are actively developing ways to handle more complex situations, like when experimental effects aren't constant across all trials. This work is a significant leap forward in bridging the gap between experimental and correlational psychology. It offers a more sophisticated way to analyze data, leading to more precise estimates of individual differences and a better understanding of construct validity in experimental tasks. It means we can ask deeper questions like, how reliable are our experimental measures? What underlying mental machinery do they tap into? And which tasks are the best at measuring these skills? The GenFM framework is designed to answer these questions more robustly than ever before. My take on this is that it's incredibly important. So often in psychology, we see research claiming connections or lack thereof, and it hinges on the statistical models. This paper shows how a mismatch between the data's characteristics and the model's assumptions can lead us astray. It's not just about getting a slightly different number. It's about potentially drawing entirely false conclusions about how people's minds work or differ. The standardization aspect is also brilliant, making the findings about factor loadings much more interpretable and comparable across different studies and tasks. The limitations they highlight, especially around determining the number of latent factors, are precisely the kinds of challenges that push science forward. Future work in this area will likely lead to even more precise and reliable insights into human cognition. It is a really exciting time for psychological measurement. What do you think about this new GenFM model? Does it make sense to you that the shape of your data matters so much? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown helpful, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science explained simply, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.